A steel beam, a crushed car, a woman trapped inside. And the only person who moved was a construction worker nobody knew. The executives froze. The security detail froze. $37,000 worth of emergency training, and every single one of them stood there watching a luxury sedan disappear under 2 tons of collapsing scaffolding. But one man, dirty boots, worn jacket, nobody's hero, was already running toward it. He didn't think, he didn't hesitate, he just moved. And that decision, made in less than 2 seconds, would unravel everything both of them thought they knew about the life they were supposed to be living. If stories like this hit different for you, stories about real courage, quiet sacrifice, and love that nobody saw coming, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because we're just getting started. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The morning the construction site on Meridian Avenue nearly killed someone, the sky was the color of old concrete, flat gray, no sun, the kind of sky that makes a city feel indifferent to everything happening beneath it. It was a Tuesday in early March, the kind of Tuesday where nothing is supposed to happen. Sophia Bennett arrived at 8:47 a.m. in the back seat of a company car, a black Mercedes S-Class that her assistant had arranged because Sophia's own vehicle was in for service. She was on her phone before the door even opened, reading a briefing document about the Meridian Avenue mixed-use development that her company, Bennett Development Group, was 2 years into financing. The project was behind schedule. It was always behind schedule. Everything in construction was always behind schedule, and Sophia had stopped pretending to be surprised about it a long time ago. She was 30 years old and ran one of the most profitable mid-sized development companies on the eastern seaboard. She'd inherited the company from her father at 24, after his stroke, and spent 6 years transforming what was a solid regional firm into something that regularly appeared in industry publications and occasionally in business magazines. She was good at it. She was better than good at it. She just wasn't always sure it made her happy, and she'd mostly stopped asking herself that question because the asking didn't seem to lead anywhere useful. Her assistant Marcus had flagged the site visit as low priority, a routine walkthrough, shake hands with the project managers, demonstrate executive engagement. 45 minutes maximum. She had a board call at 11. The Mercedes pulled to the curb along the south edge of the construction perimeter. Through the tinted glass, Sophia could see the skeletal upper floors of what would eventually become a 15-story mixed-use building. Retail below, residential above, the kind of project that looked transformational on a presentation slide and looked like organized chaos in person. She ended her call. "I'll be 40 minutes," she told the driver. She stepped out. What happened in the next 90 seconds was later described in the official incident report as a structural failure caused by fatigued secondary bracing on the southeastern scaffold tower. A single connector pin, stressed past tolerance by a week of temperature fluctuations, gave way at 8:51 a.m. The cascade was almost instantaneous. Upper sections of the scaffold structure dropped. A horizontal steel beam, roughly 14 feet long, weighing somewhere north of 800 pounds, tore loose from its mount, deflected off a lower crossmember, and came down at an angle across the back section of the Mercedes. The roof caved. The rear passenger compartment compressed. Both rear tires blew. Sophia was thrown sideways into the door frame and then back across the seat as the vehicle lurched and partially collapsed. Her phone hit the ceiling. Glass from the rear window came in all at once, small cubes of it catching in her hair and across the back of her jacket. Something hit her left shoulder. She didn't know what, couldn't process it. There was noise unlike anything she'd experienced, a grinding metallic shriek layered under a deep concussive boom, and then a weight settling over the vehicle that felt almost geological, like the car had been swallowed. Then it was quiet. Not completely quiet. She could hear shouting from somewhere above her, voices multiplying rapidly, the crackle of radio communication. She could hear a slow metallic groan from whatever had landed on the car. She could smell dust, thick, chalky construction dust, and something chemical that might have been hydraulic fluid. She tried to move. Her left arm responded badly. She wasn't sure if it was the shoulder or if she was just shaking. The door beside her was jammed, deformed inward at the frame. The opposite door was blocked by what appeared to be scaffold sections. The front of the car was accessible in theory, but the steel beam had come down at an angle that left the rear compartment significantly lower than the front, and the structural integrity of the roof above her was, she could see cracks propagating through the headliner in real time. It was getting worse. Outside, she could hear someone, multiple people, yelling for equipment, for backup, for someone to call someone. She heard a man's voice cutting through the others, clipped and certain, saying something about a secondary load path. She didn't understand what that meant. She was aware that she was breathing very fast. She was also aware, with the particular clarity that crisis sometimes produces, that the car was slowly continuing to compress around her, and that if no one got to her quickly, the margin was going to close. She pressed herself toward the front seat and tried to call out. Her voice came out strange, not as loud as she intended. 40 feet away, on the far side of the site perimeter, Daniel Carter had heard the collapse before he saw it. He'd been on the second floor of the adjacent structure, walking a section of freshly poured concrete slab with a measuring tape in one hand and a coffee thermos wedged under his arm. He'd heard the high-pitched metallic snap of the connector giving way, a sound distinct from normal construction noise, a sound that his body processed before his conscious mind did, a sound he associated, without wanting to, with things that were much louder and much worse and very far away. He was moving before he made a decision to move. That was just how it worked for him, and he'd stopped fighting it a long time ago. He came down the exterior stairs 3 at a time, shed his thermos somewhere on the second step without noticing, and cleared the perimeter fence at the south corner by stepping on the bottom rail and going over. A supervisor was yelling something at him. He registered it as ambient noise. The Mercedes was bad. He saw that immediately. The beam had come down at an angle across the rear, and the vehicle wasn't stable. There was a secondary section of scaffold above it that had partially caught on a lip of exposed rebar, and it was not going to stay caught. He couldn't see exactly how long that section had been holding or what its failure threshold was. He didn't have time to work it out mathematically. He went to the driver's side rear door first, because that was where the beam hadn't crushed, and tried the handle. Jammed. He could hear her inside now. A woman's voice, trying to say something, not panicking, which was a good sign, but the voice had a compression to it, the sound of someone working very hard to stay controlled. "I'm coming through the window," he said, loud and clear, not a question. I used the butt of his measuring tape on the already cracked window, and the glass came out in sections. He swept the frame as clean as he could with his gloved forearm. He could feel it cutting through the leather even as he did it, and got his upper body through the opening. She was in the back seat, leaning toward the center, one arm tucked against her chest, glass in her hair. Younger than he'd expected. She was looking at him with brown eyes that had that particular quality, not quite fear, more like someone who is very intelligently calculating their odds and does not love what the numbers are telling them. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. A beat. "The roof is—" "I know. No, don't look at it. Look at me." She looked at him. "Can you move your legs?" "Yes." "Your left arm?" A pause. "I don't know." "Okay, we're going to do this fast. I'm going to reach across you. My arm's going to go across your chest, and I'm going to pull you toward the window. I need you to help me with your right arm and your legs. Push as much as you can. Do not use your left arm. Ready?" "Yes." Above them, the suspended scaffold section groaned. He didn't look up. He reached in. She grabbed his forearm with her right hand, a strong grip, better than he expected. And he got his arm across her upper back and pulled. She pushed with her legs. They moved maybe 8 inches in the first pull, which wasn't enough. The scaffold groaned again. "Again," he said. 3, 2. He didn't finish the count. He pulled and she pushed, and this time they got enough clearance. He came backward out of the window with her, her torso clearing the frame as he absorbed her weight and pivoted, and they were maybe 6 feet clear of the vehicle when the suspended scaffold section let go. It came down onto the already crushed rear of the Mercedes with a sound like a building falling, which was essentially what it was. The vehicle buckled completely. What had been a crushed rear compartment became something unrecognizable. Daniel was on one knee on the asphalt, one hand still gripping Sophia's jacket, the other hand flat on the ground. Dust came over them in a wave. He felt pieces of debris hit his back and shoulder and neck. Small things, nothing structural, and he bent forward and covered her head with his arm until the wave passed. Then there was stillness. Sophia was breathing. He could feel it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly into the collar of his jacket, You didn't run. No, he said. She pushed back slightly and looked at him. Her face was cut in two places. One small laceration on her forehead, one along her jaw. Her left shoulder was held carefully. Her hair was wrecked. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, more like the look of someone who has just recategorized something. Around them, the site was erupting. Supervisors, workers, security personnel who had been standing at a perimeter distance were now converging. Someone was calling for an ambulance. Someone had a first aid kit. Someone was trying to talk to Sophia directly, reaching past Daniel, calling her Ms. Bennett. She let them. But she kept her eyes on him for another second, and there was something in that look, assessing, searching, like she was trying to find the name for what he was. Daniel stood up. He checked himself quickly. Cuts on his forearm where the window frame had gotten through the glove. One on his neck he could feel but not see. Debris scrapes across his shoulders. Nothing serious. He rolled his shoulder once, tested the range. Fine. Someone pressed a first aid kit into his hands. He set it down beside Sophia, who was now being attended to by two people at once, and was telling them, in a voice that had recovered its authority remarkably fast, that she was fine and that someone needed to call the structural inspector immediately before anyone else entered the site perimeter. She was already managing it, already working. He almost smiled. Instead, he took a step back. Then another. The crowd around the vehicle had thickened considerably. Workers, supervisors, a man in a hard hat who appeared to be some kind of project executive, two paramedics who had arrived with extraordinary speed from somewhere nearby. Nobody was watching Daniel specifically. He picked up his jacket from where it had landed on the asphalt during the rescue. He shook the dust off at once, folded it over his arm. He walked back toward the site entrance. At the perimeter, he stopped. He looked back once, not at the wreckage, not at the crowd, at her specifically, visible through the gap between two paramedics. She was holding her left shoulder, but she was sitting upright, and she was gesturing, directing, already oriented toward the next problem. She'd be okay. He turned and walked away. Nobody called after him. Why would they? He was just a construction worker in a site vest, moving through a crowd of construction workers in site vests. He blended into the site the way he'd always blended into everything, completely, without trying, which was a habit he'd built a long time ago for reasons he didn't think about if he could help it. He retrieved his thermos from the second step of the exterior stairwell. The coffee was still warm. I went back to work. Later that evening, he picked Grace up from the after-school program at Kensington Elementary. She was sitting on the front steps with her backpack on her lap and a drawing she'd made in art class, which she presented to him with the seriousness of someone delivering important documentation. "It's our apartment," she explained, pointing. "And that's me, and that's you, and that's Biscuit." "Biscuit's very realistic," he said. "I know, I'm good at cats." Biscuit was a neighbor's cat who occasionally visited their apartment and whom Grace had essentially adopted by declaration. The cat's legal owners didn't seem to mind. Daniel folded the drawing carefully along its original crease and put it in the chest pocket of his jacket. Grace noticed the cuts on his forearm when he reached for her hand at the crosswalk. "What happened?" "Work stuff, broken glass." She examined the bandaged area with clinical interest. "Does it hurt?" "Not really." "Is it okay?" "It's fine." She accepted this. She was 6, but she was not a child who pressed when she sensed a door being closed. She'd learned to read him better than most adults ever managed, which sometimes unnerved him, and mostly just made him quietly proud. They walked home through the neighborhood in the early evening light. She told him about what her friend Priya had said at recess, and about the caterpillar they'd found in the garden bed near the soccer field, and about how she thought caterpillars probably liked classical music. He listened to all of it. He asked questions about the caterpillar. He disagreed about the classical music. He thought maybe they'd be more into something with drums. Grace considered this seriously. "That makes sense," she said. "Caterpillars seem like they'd be drummers." Hannah made a pasta that night. She did her reading assignment while he cooked, sitting at the kitchen table with her feet not quite reaching the floor, sounding out words slowly, correcting herself, moving on. He listened to her read while he stirred and listened for what she was struggling with and didn't correct her unless she stalled completely. After dinner, after the dishes, after she was in bed and he'd read 2 chapters of the book they were working through about a girl who discovers a hidden world inside a library, After her breathing had evened out into sleep, he sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the television on low. The news was running a segment on the site collapse. He watched it for a moment without sound. There was footage from someone's phone, shaky, distant, not very useful. There was a graphic that said, "Mystery Hero, who is he?" There was a photograph, taken from some angle he hadn't noticed, of his back as he carried her clear of the window, blurry and partially obscured by dust and the movement of the crowd. Just his back. His jacket. Unidentifiable. He watched the segment finish. They cut to a reporter outside what appeared to be a hospital. He picked up the remote and turned it off. He sat with the quiet for a while. Then he finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. In the next room, Grace slept the uncomplicated sleep of a 6-year-old who trusted completely that the world would hold still while she was unconscious. Daniel listened to her breathe for a moment through the thin wall. He closed his eyes. The shoulder was a grade 2 AC sprain. The attending physician at Mercy General told Sophia this with the careful tone of someone expecting an argument, and she delivered one, briefly, before accepting the sling and the anti-inflammatory prescription and the instruction to rest it for 3 weeks. She was back in the office by 2 in the afternoon of the same day, sling on, jacket draped over it, assistant trailing behind her with a look that suggested he had already lost this particular fight and was making peace with that. The board call happened at 4 instead of 11. She ran it herself. But at night, alone in her apartment on the 14th floor of a building she partly owned, Sophia sat on her couch with a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink and found herself thinking about his hands. Not in any romantic sense. She was too practical for that kind of distraction and too aware of it when it was happening. She thought about them in a specific, almost technical way. The way they'd moved inside that car. The efficiency of it. No wasted motion, no fumbling, no hesitation that came from fear. She'd been in enough high-pressure meetings to recognize the difference between someone performing calm and someone who was actually calm, and that man had been actually calm in a situation that had made trained security professionals stand at a distance and wait for instructions. She wanted to know who he was. She told herself it was because she owed him a thank you. That was true. It was also incomplete. Marcus ran the investigation, which took 11 days. It turned out to be less complicated than Sophia expected, which itself told her something. The man hadn't tried to hide. He hadn't given a false name when site managers finally pieced together who'd been working that section. He'd simply gone back to work and not mentioned it, which wasn't the same thing as hiding. It was more like indifference to recognition, which Sophia found more interesting than deliberate concealment. His name was Daniel Carter. He was 37. He worked as a senior laborer for Hartwell Construction, which was one of 3 contractors Bennett Development Group had on the Meridian Avenue project. He had a daughter named Grace, 6 years old, enrolled at Kensington Elementary. He lived in a 3rd-floor apartment on Callaway Street in the Denton district, which was the kind of neighborhood that appeared on city planning documents as underserved, and appeared in reality as a grid of tired buildings occupied by people who worked very hard and couldn't yet afford to live somewhere that wasn't tired. His employment file listed previous work history at 2 other construction firms over the past 5 years. Before that, there was a gap. The gap was long enough to be intentional. Marcus, to his credit, flagged the gap without being asked to. Sophia looked at the file for a long time. Then she had her assistant draft a formal letter on Bennett Development Group letterhead requesting that Mr. Daniel Carter attend a meeting at the company's headquarters at his earliest convenience. She reviewed the draft twice, changed 2 words, and sent it. It took him 4 days to respond. When he did, he responded by phone, not in writing, calling the main office number rather than the direct line Marcus had included in the letter. He spoke to a receptionist, confirmed he'd received the correspondence, and said he could come in on Thursday at 10 if that worked. Sophia moved 2 meetings to make 10 o'clock on Thursday work. She spent more time than she would admit preparing for the meeting. Not nervously. She didn't get nervous before meetings, or told herself she didn't, but carefully. She thought about what she wanted to say and how. She thought about what she owed him and what she wanted to offer, and how to make those things land correctly with someone she knew almost nothing about. She had her assistant arrange coffee and fruit in the small conference room off her main office, which was less formal than the large boardroom but more professional than her personal office, a middle register. She chose it deliberately. He arrived at 9:58. She watched him cross the lobby on the security camera feed that mirrored to her computer, a habit she'd developed for high-stakes meetings, reading people before they knew they were being read. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing dark trousers and a collared shirt that was clean and pressed but not expensive. His hair was still slightly damp, which meant he'd showered close to leaving. He walked like someone who knew exactly where his body was in space at all times, which was a specific quality she'd noticed in certain people and had never been able to fully articulate. When her assistant brought him to the conference room, Sophia was standing, not sitting, which she'd decided put them on more equal footing from the start. "Mr. Carter," she said, and extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." He shook it. His grip was measured, not soft, not performative. "Ms. Bennett." "Sophia, please." She gestured to the chairs. "Sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee?" "I'm fine." He sat. He didn't look around the room the way most people did, cataloging it, processing the signals of wealth and status. He looked at her. "How's the shoulder?" She was caught slightly off guard by that. Not the question, the directness of it as an opener. "Better," she said. "Grade 2 sprain. I'm supposed to be in the sling for another 2 weeks. I left it at home this morning, which my doctor would not approve of." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Does it hurt?" "When I reach across my body. Otherwise, no." She sat down across from him. "I want to start by saying thank you, properly. I know there's already been communication from the company, a formal thank you letter, some flowers that were probably generic and impersonal, which I apologize for. Those were handled by people who didn't know what to send because I hadn't told them how serious it was. You don't have to—" "I'm not finished." She said it lightly, not sharply. "I was in that car for about 40 seconds before you reached me. I know that doesn't sound like very long. It felt long. The roof was moving. I could see it moving. And I did the math, which is something I tend to do, and the math was not good." She paused. "You moved when nobody else did. I want you to know that I understand what that means." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup once on the table, even though he hadn't poured any. "Someone needed help," he said. "It wasn't complicated. For you, maybe. Not for the 6 other people standing there." He didn't have an answer to that, or if he did, he kept it. Sophia pulled a folder from the table beside her. She'd had it placed there beforehand, deliberately casual positioning. "I'd like to offer you something. Not as payment, I understand that framing would be wrong, as an opportunity." She opened the folder. "Bennett Development Group has an operations leadership division that manages our active construction projects. We need someone with field experience in a senior coordinator role. The position comes with a significant salary increase from what you're currently earning, full benefits, company vehicle, and a clear advancement track." She slid the folder toward him. "Your work history shows you're capable. Your on-site supervisors speak highly of you. And frankly, the qualities you demonstrated on Tuesday are exactly what I want in someone managing complex site operations." He looked at the folder. He didn't touch it. "You can take it with you. Look it over." "I appreciate it," he said. "I'm going to say no." She stopped. "You haven't looked at the numbers." "The numbers aren't the issue." "Then what is?" He was quiet for a moment, and it wasn't the quiet of someone searching for a polite way to decline. It was the quiet of someone who knew exactly what they wanted to say and was deciding how much of it to offer. "I acted because it was the right thing to do," he said. "That's the only reason. I don't want it to become a transaction." Sophia sat back slightly. "I'm not trying to make it a transaction. I'm trying to—" "I know what you're trying to do." Not unkind, just certain. "You're trying to solve a problem. Someone did something good for you, and now you have an imbalance on your ledger, and you want to close it out. I get it. That's how you're wired." He looked at her steadily. "But it's not how I'm wired. And if I took the job to make you feel better about what happened, I'd be taking it for the wrong reason, and you'd eventually have a person in a senior operations role who didn't actually want to be there. That wouldn't be good for either of us." The room was very quiet. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. She was used to people either wanting things from her or being intimidated by her, and Daniel Carter was demonstrably neither, which was disorienting in a way she didn't entirely dislike. "You're saying no to a position that would double your income," she said. "Yes. Because of principle. Because it's not the right reason to take a job." She looked at him for another beat. Then she closed the folder. All right, she said. I disagree with you, but I hear you. He nodded once. Thank you for the offer. I mean that. She walked him out herself, which she didn't usually do. In the elevator, they stood side by side in the particular silence of two people who have said more than they expected and are both still processing it. At the lobby, he stopped and turned to her. For what it's worth, he said, the shoulder. You should actually wear the sling. I know it's inconvenient, but the AC joint doesn't heal right if you keep loading it. She stared at him. I've had the injury, he added, which didn't entirely explain how he'd known from across a conference table that she was compensating. He nodded once, like punctuation, and walked out through the glass doors into the gray March morning. Sophia stood in her lobby for a moment, which she almost never did. Then she went back to work. She thought she wouldn't see him again. She was fine with that conclusion, or told herself she was, which amounted to roughly the same thing for the first week, and then less cleanly the second. What she didn't expect was the park. It was a Saturday in late March, still cold enough for a coat, the sky doing something indeterminate between overcast and actually threatening. She'd been at the office until noon, a half day, which for her represented significant restraint, and was walking back to her apartment via a route she took occasionally through Callaway Park, which was a mid-sized neighborhood green space wedged between 2 blocks of residential buildings that her company had looked at for development 3 years ago and ultimately passed on. She almost walked past them. The girl was wearing a yellow coat that was hard to miss, crouched at the edge of the duck pond with a plastic bag of something, tossing pieces methodically into the water with the focused generosity of someone who takes the feeding of ducks very seriously. The man was standing a few feet behind her with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching her, and Sophia recognized the jacket immediately. It was the same one, the worn canvas work jacket from the site, the one she'd thought about more than once in the past 3 weeks, without fully acknowledging that she was thinking about it. She slowed. She should have kept walking. She was aware of this. There was a reasonable social logic in which you did not approach someone who had already declined your professional offer in order to insert yourself into their weekend, and she was generally a person who understood social logic. She stopped walking entirely. The girl looked up from the ducks and saw her first. "Hi," the girl said, the directness of small children, unfiltered. "Do you want to feed the ducks? We have extra bread." Daniel turned. He was surprised. She could see it, a brief reorganization of his expression, but he covered it quickly, and it wasn't an unwelcoming surprise, more like the surprise of someone whose categories have just been rearranged. "Ms. Bennett," he said. "Sophia." She took 2 steps off the path. "I live about 6 blocks that direction. I walk through here sometimes." She wasn't sure why she felt the need to explain this, except that she didn't want him to think she'd followed him, which she hadn't, but which could very reasonably be suspected given the 11-day investigation and the formal letter and the conference room. "It's a good park," he said, which was a generous response, all things considered. The girl had approached her directly, holding out the plastic bag. Up close, she was unmistakably his daughter. Same dark eyes, same quality of stillness under the surface energy. "I'm Grace," she said. "What's your name?" "Sophia." "That's a good name. Do you know what kind of ducks these are?" "I don't." Grace turned to her father with an expression that clearly meant this is something we need to address. "Mallards," Daniel said, not to Grace specifically, more to the air between them. "The ones with the green heads are males." Grace turned back to Sophia. "They fight sometimes," she said with a certain relish. "The males fight over the females. It's kind of dramatic." "That's true of most species," Sophia said. Something shifted in Daniel's face. Not a smile exactly, but the infrastructure of one. Grace pressed the bag toward her. "Here. You hold it with your fingers like this, and then you throw pieces. Not all at once, because then they fight more, and the small ones don't get any." Sophia took the bag. She crouched at the edge of the pond beside Grace and tore off a piece of bread and threw it. 2 ducks turned immediately. The small one Grace had been referring to darted in from the left and got there first. "Good," Grace said, with the satisfaction of a coach whose instruction has been correctly executed. They stayed at the pond for probably 20 minutes. Grace narrated the social dynamics of the duck population with extraordinary detail for a 6-year-old, including which ones she'd named and which ones were rude, and Sophia fed bread and asked questions and did not look at Daniel more than she should have. He stood slightly back from them, watching, mostly quiet, the way he'd been on the construction site before the collapse, present and aware in a way that wasn't passive, more like someone who had learned that silence was its own kind of participation. When the bread ran out, Grace announced with some authority that they should get ice cream next. "It's 43 degrees, Daniel said. "Ice cream is temperature independent," Grace said. He looked at Sophia with an expression that very clearly communicated that this was an argument he had lost before and expected to lose again. "She's not wrong," Sophia said. "See," said Grace. There was a small shop 2 blocks from the park that sold soft-serve cones and appeared to operate year-round on optimism alone. Grace got chocolate with sprinkles and held it with both hands and walked between them on the sidewalk with the concentrated intensity of someone navigating serious structural engineering, keeping it level, rotating it slightly to manage melt, biting preemptively at an overhanging edge. Sophia got vanilla. Daniel got nothing, then accepted the last several bites of Grace's cone when she declared herself finished, which she observed was how this probably always went. They walked. It wasn't planned, none of it was. They were just moving in roughly the same direction through a neighborhood that existed at an ordinary register, a bodega, a dry cleaner, a woman walking a large and unhurried dog, 2 kids on bikes arguing about something with the energy of people who have been arguing about the same thing all day. Grace, satisfied by the ice cream and the ducks, dropped back slightly behind them and was occupied with a loose thread on her sleeve. "She's remarkable," Sophia said quietly. "She's a lot," Daniel said. "Same thing mostly." "How long has it been?" She stopped. "Sorry, that's probably too personal." 3 years, he said. Her mom left when Grace was 3. He didn't say it with particular weight, just stated it, a fact of geography. It was mutual, mostly. We weren't good together. Grace adapted better than I did, which probably tells you something about which of us is actually more mature. Sophia didn't say anything, and he seemed to appreciate that she didn't fill it with something reassuring. "She doesn't miss what she doesn't remember," he added after a moment. "I used to feel bad about that. Now I think it might just be how kids work." "What do you miss?" She asked it without quite intending to. He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which she was starting to recognize as a particular quality of his. He didn't answer questions faster than he could answer them honestly. "Sleeping past 5:30, he said, "and coffee that I make for myself instead of against a deadline." It wasn't the real answer, and they both knew it, but it wasn't a deflection exactly either. It was more like a door set slightly ajar. Enough light coming through to see there was a room, not enough to see what was in it. They walked Grace home to the apartment building on Calloway Street, which Sophia now recognized from the investigation file. She recognized the street address and felt a brief, uncomfortable awareness of how much she'd found out about this man without his knowledge, which was normal corporate due diligence, and also, she acknowledged, a little aggressive. At the entrance, Grace hugged Sophia around the middle with the unceremonious confidence of a child who had already decided a person was acceptable. "Come feed the ducks with us next Saturday," Grace said. Not a question. Sophia glanced at Daniel, who had the look of a man who wanted to give his daughter the ability to invite people but was also aware that this had moved faster than expected. "If that's okay," Sophia said. "It's okay," Grace said, before Daniel could answer. He watched her with an expression that was approximately 60% exasperated and 40% something else. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." Sophia walked back to her apartment through the cold afternoon, hands in her coat pockets, thinking about things she didn't usually let herself think about. The way Grace had just extended trust without calculating it first. The way Daniel looked at his daughter. Not like she was something he'd been given, but like she was something he'd chosen, every day, over and over, and would keep choosing. She was not a person who envied things easily. It was a quality she'd worked for, an emotional equilibrium she'd cultivated because envy was inefficient and she'd always had enough. But walking home through a neighborhood she'd once considered developing and had ultimately passed on, she felt something that was adjacent to it. Not wanting what he had exactly, but recognizing that he had something she'd been too busy to notice the absence of. The next Saturday, she came back. Grace was waiting at the entrance to the park in the yellow coat with a new bag of bread and a very clear agenda. They fell into it naturally, the 3 of them, which was both strange and not. Grace was the fixed point around which everything organized, her observations, her questions, her specific and occasionally exhausting opinions about which ducks deserved which treatment. And Sophia and Daniel moved around that center, talking around Grace and through her and sometimes to each other in the particular quiet way of adults sharing a child's afternoon. The second Saturday, Sophia brought the bread. Grace approved of this development. The third Saturday, it rained lightly, and they fed the ducks anyway because Grace pointed out that ducks didn't care about rain, which was objectively correct. Daniel made coffee afterward at the apartment. Not for Sophia specifically, he said. He was making it anyway. And they sat in the small kitchen while Grace went to change her socks and became occupied with something in her room that required more attention than the socks. The kitchen was clean and worn in the way of a space that's been used hard for a long time and maintained carefully. A drawing Grace had made of the park ducks was taped to the side of the refrigerator next to a school calendar. Sophia sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug that had a chip on the rim and watched Daniel pour his own coffee and thought, with the odd clarity that small domestic moments sometimes produced, that she could not remember the last time she'd sat in a kitchen on a Saturday morning. Not her own kitchen, she had one, rarely used, but a kitchen that felt like it actually functioned, like the people inside it used it every day for something other than reheating takeout. "You're doing it again," Daniel said. She looked up. "Assessing the room," he said. "You do it when you think nobody's watching. Occupational hazard. What's the assessment?" She looked around this kitchen honestly. The drawing on the fridge, the chipped mug, the school calendar, the window over the sink that looked out onto the back of an adjacent building, nothing scenic. "It's a good room," she said. He sat down across from her. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised, She stopped. "I spend a lot of time in rooms that are expensive," she said. "This room isn't expensive, but it's—" She was struggling for the right word, which didn't happen to her often. "Lived in," he said. "Yeah." He nodded once, like he understood something he hadn't asked about. From the other room, Grace's voice. "Dad, where's my library book?" "Shelf above your desk." A pause. "It's not there." "It's there. Look again." Silence. Then, "Oh, yeah, it's here." Sophia smiled into her coffee. She noticed that he didn't say "I told you." He just let it land. Over those weeks, she paid attention to things she would not have cataloged a month ago. The way he always positioned himself with his back to walls in public spaces, never the exposed middle. The way he scanned rooms on entry, not anxiously, more like breathing, automatic and thorough. The way he moved through crowds with an efficiency that left no footprint, no jostled shoulder, no disruption, as though he'd calculated 6 steps in advance, and all of them were already resolved. The way, one afternoon when a car backfired 2 blocks away, his whole body went briefly rigid before releasing, and he said nothing about it, continued whatever he'd been saying without break. And Grace, reading the signal she'd clearly learned to read, reached up and took his hand for a moment and then let go. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Neither of them mentioned it. Sophia filed that away, quietly, with the other things she was beginning to understand about the shape of him. The absence in his employment history, the instincts that were too trained to be learned on construction sites, the calm in that crushed car that had nothing to do with luck or temperament. She didn't ask. It wasn't her door to open. But she thought about it. She was still thinking about it 6 weeks after the park, sitting in a strategy meeting on the 14th floor of her building with 3 department heads and a detailed 5-year development plan on the screen, when Marcus passed her a note that said the Callaway Street building, Daniel's building, had just failed a city safety inspection, and the landlord had been notified of mandatory repair orders with a 60-day compliance window. She looked at the note. Then she looked back at the screen. She told herself it was just information. She told herself she was not going to do anything with it. She believed this for about 3 days. Then she pulled the property records for the Callaway Street building, identified the ownership entity, made 3 calls, and quietly arranged a conversation between the landlord and Bennett Development Group's Community Investment Division about the possibility of a renovation partnership, which was a real program she ran for real reasons, which would involve real improvements to the building, which happened to be where Daniel Carter lived, which she told herself was a coincidence of geography and civic responsibility. She was aware, in a clear and honest part of herself, that this was not entirely true. She was also aware that Daniel, when he found out, and he would find out, She knew his quality of attention well enough by now to know he would find out, was not going to see it as civic responsibility. She did it anyway, which told her something she hadn't quite been ready to name about what the last 6 weeks had actually been. He found out on a Wednesday. He came home from the site at 5:15, later than usual because a delivery had arrived wrong and he'd stayed to supervise the restack rather than leave it for the next crew, which was just how he operated. Not heroically, just practically, because things done wrong had a way of compounding. He was tired in the specific way of someone who'd been on their feet for 9 hours on concrete, a tiredness that lived in the lower back and the heels and didn't fully leave until you'd been horizontal for a while. He was in the stairwell when he passed Mrs. Okafor from the second floor, who was coming down with her recycling bag and who stopped him with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting to deliver information all day. "Did you see?" she said. "See what?" "The notice. In the lobby. And they were here this afternoon. 2 men with clipboards. Going through the boiler room, the hallways, up on the roof." She adjusted her recycling bag. "Building maintenance. Your lady from the development company arranged it," they said. Daniel was very still for a moment. "What do you mean, my lady from the development company?" Mrs. Okafor gave him the look of someone who considers herself an accurate observer of her environment. "The one who came to pick up Grace that one time, when you were stuck at work. Sophia something. The tall one." He took the stairs to the 3rd floor, read the notice posted on the hallway bulletin board, and stood there long enough to read it twice. Bennett Development Group Community Investment Division. Comprehensive Structural and Systems Assessment. Planned renovation in partnership with building ownership. Estimated scope. Exterior repairs, boiler replacement, elevator modernization, common area improvements. He went into the apartment. Grace was at the kitchen table doing homework with the focused misery of someone working through long division, which she had recently decided was a personal insult designed specifically to test her patience. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, Bug." He made dinner. He let Grace tell him about the math homework. He helped her with 2 problems, explained the 3rd, watched her work the 4th herself with the particular satisfaction of a kid who has understood something new. He read with her after dinner. He waited until she was asleep. Then he sat in the kitchen in the quiet and thought about what he wanted to say and how. He called Sophia at 9 o'clock. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "The building notice," he said. A pause. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "When it was further along. When there was something concrete to point to." "So I couldn't say no." She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Sophia." He kept his voice level. Not cold, but level. "I told you no at the meeting. I thought that was clear. It's not the same thing. It's a community investment program. We run these in multiple neighborhoods. It's not something I invented for your building. Is this building on the program list before this week?" Another pause. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He exhaled slowly. "Okay. Daniel, I need to think for a minute." She went quiet. He appreciated that she didn't fill it. He sat back in the kitchen chair and looked at the ceiling, which had a water stain in the far corner that the landlord had promised to address for the better part of 2 years. He thought about what bothered him, specifically because it wasn't simple. It wasn't just that she'd done something without asking. It was the shape of it, the way she'd moved resources, leveraged her position, solved a problem she'd identified from the outside, for people who hadn't asked to be solved. "You know what you did?" he said finally. "I fixed something that needed to be fixed." You arranged things for people without consulting them and then planned to present it as a done deal, because you decided it was good for them. The building failed a safety inspection. People are living there. You're living there. Grace is, "I know what the building is." Then you know it needed work. Yes. He didn't argue that, but that's not the point. Then what is the point? He thought about how to say it. "You're trying to solve people," he said, "the same way you solve business problems. You see something that's inefficient or broken, you mobilize resources, you fix it, you move on. And it works, mostly. In business, it probably works 90% of the time." He paused. "But I'm not a property acquisition. And what you're doing, but even if it comes from a good place, it doesn't ask. It just does. And the people on the receiving end of that don't get to be anything except the recipients." The line was quiet for a long moment. That's not what I intended, she said. Her voice had changed slightly, lower, less defended. I know it's not. I just wanted to... She stopped, started again. I don't know how to do what you do. I don't know how to just let things be wrong when I can see a way to fix them. I know, he said, and he meant it. But sometimes fixing isn't the same as helping. She didn't say anything for a while. I'll pull the program referral, she said quietly. I'll tell them the building isn't ready for the partnership yet. Buy time, whatever you want. Don't pull it, he said. The building does need work. Mrs. Okafor's been dealing with a broken heating valve since November, and the elevator's been intermittent for 6 months. He paused. But next time, you ask first. Okay, she said. I mean it. I know you do. A beat. I'm sorry, Daniel. He sat with that for a moment. The way she said his name, not corporate, not careful, just his name. Get some sleep, he said. He ended the call and sat in the kitchen for another 20 minutes before going to bed. Things were different after that, not broken. They still met on Saturdays. Grace still commanded the duck pond with her specific authority. They still drank coffee in his kitchen while she worked on something and listened to Grace in the other room. But there was a new kind of distance that hadn't been there before. A carefulness on Sophia's part that he could feel, an awareness she was carrying, and he wasn't sure whether it would resolve itself into something better or just calcify into politeness. He didn't know how to fix it either, which struck him as ironic. He was thinking about this on a Thursday evening in late April when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and he almost didn't answer it, and then something made him pick up. Carter. The voice was immediate, familiar in a way that reached past his conscious mind and landed somewhere older. It's Tanner. Marcus Tanner. He'd served with Daniel for 4 years in SEAL Team 6. He was currently, or had been, the last Daniel knew, working in private security consulting out of D.C. Tanner, Daniel said. He walked to the kitchen window reflexively. How did you get this number? The same way I get all numbers. Don't be dramatic. A pause. You doing all right? I'm fine. Heard you pulled someone out of a construction collapse a couple months back. That was in the news for about a day and a half. It was nothing. Right, nothing. The way everything's nothing with you. Tanner's voice shifted register, the way it did when he was moving from small talk to the actual call. I'm reaching out because I've got something that's got your name on it. Security consultation, 6 weeks, government adjacent. Good money, and I mean actually good money, not field rate money. You'd be back in DC part-time, rest is remote. I know you've got the kid. No, Daniel said. Carter. I'm out, Tanner. That doesn't change. I know you're out. It's not operational. It's advisory, threat assessment, planning documentation. They need someone who's actually been in the rooms these scenarios come from. Find someone who's still in the rooms. There's a reason I'm calling you specifically. You have a particular... Marcus. He used the first name deliberately. I appreciate the call. I'm not coming back. Not for 6 weeks, not for a weekend briefing. I'm done with that world. A pause on the other end. When Tanner spoke again, the sales pitch was gone. Just two men who'd been in bad places together and had different ideas about what came after. You ever miss it? Tanner asked. Daniel looked out the kitchen window at the back of the adjacent building, the fire escape, the water tower 3 blocks over going red at the top from the evening light. No, he said. I wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it was the answer that kept him in this kitchen, in this apartment, with Grace asleep 20 feet away, and that was the answer that mattered. All right, Tanner said. You've got my number now. If that changes. It won't. He hung up and stood at the window for a while longer. Then he heated up the leftover pasta from dinner, ate it standing at the counter, and went to check that Grace's window was latched the way he did every night before he let himself sleep. The Callaway Street building renovation started in early May. It came in phases. Exterior first, then the boiler, then the elevator. The workers were quiet and professional and finished earlier than projected on the exterior phase, which was unusual enough that Mrs. Okafor mentioned it twice. Daniel watched the work with the eye of someone who knew what correct looked like and what corners looked like when they were being cut, and the work was correct. He grudgingly acknowledged to himself only that Sophia's people did good work. He told her so one Saturday morning in his kitchen, which was its own kind of olive branch. She looked up from her coffee with an expression that was surprised and then careful, like she was making sure she'd heard it correctly before responding. "Thank you," she said. "The boiler crew is good. The exterior framing work is better than it needed to be. I'll tell them." A beat. "Do you want to actually say I did something right, or are you going to keep attributing it to anonymous contractors?" He looked at her over his own mug. "You did something right. That physically hurt you to say." "A little," he said. She smiled. It was the first time in 3 weeks that the carefulness had come fully off her face, and the room felt different with it gone. Lighter, less formal, more like the Saturdays before the notice on the bulletin board. Grace came in from her room with a drawing she wanted Sophia's opinion on, which required Sophia's full attention and analysis. And the moment passed, and the morning moved forward. May settled into a rhythm. The renovation continued. Grace finished the school year with a report card that included the observation from her teacher that she was enthusiastic and occasionally tangential in class discussions, which Daniel read 3 times and decided was accurate and probably hereditary from a side of the family he'd rather not examine. Sophia came to the spring recital, which Grace had not specifically invited her to but had informed her of in enough detail and on enough occasions that the invitation was implied. She sat 2 rows back from Daniel in the school auditorium and watched Grace perform a 30-second recorder piece with the concentrated intensity of someone performing surgery. And afterward, in the parking lot, she told Grace it was the best recorder performance she'd ever seen, which was demonstrably kind because it was the only recorder performance she'd ever seen. Grace accepted the compliment with appropriate seriousness. Daniel watched them stand together in the parking lot light. Grace still holding her recorder, Sophia crouched at Grace's level, listening to something about the song, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't examine too carefully. He was not good at this part. He was aware of that. He was competent, more than competent, at the parts of life that required structure and judgment and clear decision-making. He was not particularly practiced at the parts that required letting something happen without knowing in advance how it would resolve. The life he'd built was specifically engineered to minimize that category of uncertainty, because he'd had enough unresolvable uncertainty to last several lifetimes. And Grace deserved a father who was present and steady, not one who was still sorting out the parts of himself he'd left somewhere overseas in a series of operations he'd never be able to fully describe. But he was aware that the engineering had its costs, that the walls he'd built to keep certain things out also kept certain things in, and that Grace, who was perceptive beyond her years in the particular way of kids who've grown up watching one parent manage silently, had said to him once, out of nowhere, while he was making her lunch, "Dad, you should have a friend." He'd asked her what she meant. She'd shrugged the shrug of a 6-year-old who has stated the case and considers it self-evident. "A friend," she'd said. "Not just people from work." He thought about that now, watching Sophia laugh at something Grace had said, one hand braced on her knee, the parking lot light catching the side of her face. Then he stopped thinking about it and walked over to collect his daughter. The invitation for the gala came to Sophia's office on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of June. The Hargrove Foundation Charity Gala, an annual event, black tie, held at the Meridian Grand Hotel downtown, raising money for urban youth arts programs. She attended every year. It was on her calendar in perpetuity, the kind of event where her presence was expected and her donation was expected to be larger than last year's, and she managed both without drama. She thought about inviting Daniel. She almost didn't. She thought about the gap between his world and the world that event represented. The black tie requirement, the industry networking, the particular social performance of a room full of people who measured each other by portfolio size and connection density. And she thought that was not a room Daniel would enjoy, or perform well in, or want to be in on her behalf. She was trying to do better at not arranging things without asking first. She asked. She called him on a Thursday night and described the event honestly. Formal, probably dull in parts, full of people she professionally needed to be nice to, but the organization was legitimate and the auction was occasionally interesting. She said she understood entirely if it wasn't his scene. There was a pause on his end. "What do you need?" he said. She wasn't sure what he meant. "Sorry?" "From me being there. What do you need?" She thought about it. "Someone to talk to who isn't trying to get something from me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." She arranged a babysitter for Grace, a teenager from 2 floors up named Jess, who Grace had already pre-approved based on the fact that Jess owned 3 different nail polish colors and was willing to let Grace use them. The night of the gala was warm, the first genuinely warm evening of the year, the city finally shaking off the long gray of the winter and early spring. Sophia arrived in a car. Daniel met her at the entrance of the Meridian Grand in a dark suit that fit him correctly in the shoulders, which she noticed because it was unusual. Most men's suits sat wrong at the shoulders, and said nothing about how good he looked because she was practiced at not saying things that would make the air complicated. "You look like you've worn a suit before," she said instead. "Once or twice," he said. The ballroom was full. High ceilings, round tables, a stage at the far end, the ambient noise of 300 people in a large room, all being professionally pleasant at each other. Sophia navigated it with the ease of long practice. She knew who to speak to, for how long, what to say, when to move. Daniel stayed close to her right shoulder and said very little and did not appear uncomfortable, which she'd half expected. What she hadn't expected was how he moved through the room. She caught it in pieces, between conversations. The way he arrived at any position with his back to a wall or a column. The way his eyes moved across the room in a sweep pattern she recognized, from somewhere she couldn't name, as systematic rather than social. The way he identified, without appearing to look for them, every exit. The way, twice, he shifted his position before she'd noticed what was approaching. Once when a drunk guest in her peripheral vision was moving unpredictably, once when a waitstaff cluster near the bar created a temporary bottleneck she'd have walked into. He wasn't performing vigilance, he was just vigilant, the way breathing was. Automatic. Dinner was served at 8. They sat at the table Sophia was assigned, 8 people, a mix of foundation board members and donors, and one city councilman who spent most of dinner explaining his position on a zoning bill to anyone who would listen. Daniel sat beside her and ate, and occasionally asked a question that was more interesting than the answers it received. And under the table she could feel the slight tension in him. Not anxiety, something more controlled than that. The body of someone who has learned to be still in rooms where stillness was required. The program started at 9:30. The Foundation's executive director spoke for 12 minutes, which was merciful. A video played, an auction item was presented, and then, somewhere around 9:50, something changed. She didn't identify it immediately. It was a feeling first, a subtle shift in the room's texture that she couldn't source. Then Daniel, who had been partially turned toward the stage, went very still beside her. She looked at him. His eyes were moving, not panicked, not wide, precise. He was looking at the rear of the ballroom, and then at the service entrance on the left wall, and then at the 3 men near the audio-visual station who were dressed in contractor vests and who she'd noticed earlier and filed as AV staff. "Daniel?" she said quietly. "In a second." He said it without looking at her. "Don't turn around." She didn't. "The 3 men in the vests at the AV station," he said, his voice low and completely even, the kind of even that takes a long time to build. "They haven't touched any of the equipment in 40 minutes. The one on the right has a radio earpiece that's not standard event staff. The wire gauge is wrong. The 2 men who came in from the service entrance 12 minutes ago are still inside when the service entrance has been cycling staff every 4 to 6 minutes. A pause. "And there's someone on the mezzanine level who's been at the same window for 23 minutes. Sophia looked at him. "How long have you been watching all of that?" she said. "Since we sat down." There was no alarm in his voice. That was the thing that frightened her most, she realized later. Not the information, but how completely unsurprised he was by himself having it. "What do we do?" she said. "We don't do anything that looks like we know," he said. "Lean toward me like we're having a private conversation. Don't look at any of them." She leaned. "I need you to text your head of security right now. Don't call. Text. Tell him to get a plainclothes person to the rear left service entrance and the mezzanine. Tell him not to approach the AV station yet. Tell him to call local PD non-emergency, not 911, and have units positioned outside. Can you do that without it being obvious?" "Yes." "Do it." She had her phone in her lap. She typed carefully, keeping her eyes partially on the stage. She sent it. 30 seconds later, her head of security, a former detective named Carver, responded, "On it. How solid is the read?" She passed the phone to Daniel without comment. He typed, "Solid, don't wait." He handed it back. What happened next was very fast, and from where Sophia was sitting, initially almost invisible in the way of things that are happening at speed, in a crowd of people who don't know they're in danger. The first signal was the man on the mezzanine moving. She saw Daniel's eyes go there, saw his whole body change in the way she'd first seen in that crushed car, that quality of stillness converting instantly into something else. The second signal was the three men at the AV station separating, moving outward from each other in a pattern that was not random. The third signal was Daniel standing. He said quietly to the table, "Everybody stay seated, stay calm." Nobody at the table fully understood why, but something in his voice, the register of it, the particular frequency of complete authority, produced compliance before comprehension. He moved. She watched it, and she would spend considerable time afterward trying to describe it and finding that language was not built for this. He crossed the ballroom floor at a pace that was fast without appearing to run, which is its own specific skill. He reached the first of the separated men, the one moving toward the left side of the room. And what happened was brief and decisive and left the man on the floor holding his wrist, in the way of someone whose wrist has just been made to do something it didn't want to do. And a handgun that had been under the contractor vest was now across the room in a direction that handguns generally don't travel without assistance. The room was starting to react. Not full panic yet. There's a 2-second delay in crowds between an event occurring and its interpretation spreading. And Daniel was already moving to the second man, who had his hand inside his vest, and the sequence that followed was short and ended with the second man in approximately the same condition as the first, on the floor, the threat removed. The third man ran for the service entrance. Daniel didn't pursue. He pivoted instead toward the room, his eyes going up to the mezzanine, and he made a specific gesture, 2 fingers pointing, in the direction of Carver's plainclothes officer, who was already moving up the mezzanine stairs. The panic hit the room like a wave at that point. 300 people processing the same information at different speeds produced a surge toward exits that was not dangerous but was loud and dense. Daniel was back at the table in the time it took most people to stand. He put his hand on Sophia's arm and said directly, "We need to move now. Stay with me." She stayed with him. He got her out through a side exit she hadn't known was there, which meant he'd identified it earlier in the evening and cataloged it for this exact contingency. They came out into a service corridor that ran behind the ballroom and then through a fire exit into the hotel's east parking structure. He positioned her behind a structural column and stood between her and the entrance and waited, which was not the waiting of someone who was afraid, but the waiting of someone who was giving external units time to close. She stood behind the column in a black gown in a parking structure and tried to do an accurate inventory of her own condition. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with a kind of detached interest, the way you notice weather through a window. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "Are you?" He checked himself, the same rapid internal audit she'd seen him do in the car. "No." "Daniel." She said his name carefully. "What just happened?" He looked at her for a moment. "I saw a threat," he said. "I dealt with it. Those men were going to—" "Yes." He didn't let her finish, not cruelly, just containing it, keeping the scope manageable for this moment. "Yes, they were." She looked at him. In the concrete light of the parking structure, in a suit that had somehow barely been disturbed by what she'd just watched him do, he looked like what he was. Not a construction worker, not the quiet man in her kitchen on Saturday mornings, not Grace's father who disagreed about the musical preferences of caterpillars. He looked like someone who had been trained at enormous cost and over a very long time to do precisely what he'd just done. "Who are you?" she said. It came out softer than she intended. He held her gaze. Something moved across his face. Not evasion, more like a door that had been kept closed for a very long time and was now being assessed from the inside. "You already know," he said. "I want to hear you say it." He exhaled slowly, looked away for a moment, then back. "I was a Navy SEAL," he said. "SEAL Team 6, 14 years. I left 6 years ago." A pause. "I lost—" He stopped. Started again with more control. "I lost people. Too many in too short a time. And I had Grace, and she needed a father who was present, who was going to come home. And I decided that was the mission that mattered." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't tell you because it's not who I am anymore. I don't want it to be the thing that defines me. Not to you, not to Grace, not to anyone. The parking structure was very quiet around them. She heard sirens somewhere outside, police units arriving at the front of the hotel. The gap in your employment record, she said. Yeah. The way you move, the way you look at rooms. Yeah. How you knew in the car, what to do. It's muscle memory, he said. It doesn't go away. I don't want it to, because it kept you in that car, and it kept you safe tonight. But it's not. I'm not that person anymore. He said it with more force than he'd said anything else. I made a choice. Grace is the choice. She looked at him for a long time. In that look, she was doing what she always did, reading the room, assembling the facts, building a picture. And the picture that assembled itself was not what she'd expected, and also, she realized, was not entirely a surprise. It was more like confirmation of something she'd been sensing in pieces for weeks, in the way he carried himself, in the car backfiring on the street, in Grace's small hand finding his for 4 seconds before letting go. The men who were there tonight, she said, this wasn't random. Probably not, he said. You'd want to talk to Carver about that. They were there for me. He didn't confirm it and didn't deny it, which was its own confirmation. She stood with that for a moment. Okay, she said, not helplessly. More like someone resetting orientation after an unexpected shift in terrain. Okay. Carver appeared at the parking structure entrance with 2 uniformed officers and a look that suggested he had many questions and was organizing them by priority. Daniel stepped forward to meet him, and Sophia watched him move through the debrief, calm, precise, useful, and understood that this was also him. This was part of what she'd been sitting across from in her kitchen and at the duck pond and in the conference room with the closed folder. She had offered him a job and he had said no because he didn't want reward. She had arranged repairs for his building and he had been angry because she hadn't asked. She had been trying, in her particular way, to fit him into a category that made sense to her. The quiet construction worker, the devoted father, the principled man who didn't want her money. But none of those categories were large enough. He didn't fit in any of them because he was all of them simultaneously, and underneath all of them was something that had been built in classified places and never fully came off, and which tonight had put 2 armed men on the floor of a hotel ballroom and gotten her out a side door she hadn't known existed. She watched him finish with the officers and turned back to her. His suit jacket was slightly disheveled, she noticed, for the first time all evening. She thought about pointing this out. She didn't. They're going to need a statement from you, he said. I know. Do you want me to stay, she said. Please. He nodded. They walked back toward the hotel entrance together, and she thought about what he'd said. I made a choice, and what it costs to make that kind of choice, and keep making it, every morning in a small kitchen, every Saturday at a duck pond, every night checking a window latch before allowing yourself to sleep. She thought about the person she'd been trying to be in the weeks since the building notice. Better at asking, less certain of her own solutions. She thought she might not have been trying hard enough. The police investigation took 3 weeks to produce something usable. Carver ran point on the coordination with the department, which was his element. He'd spent 19 years as a detective before Sophia hired him, and he moved through departmental bureaucracy with the ease of someone who knew exactly which doors to knock on and which to walk past entirely. The 2 men Daniel had neutralized in the ballroom were both connected through a layered series of shell arrangements to a commercial real estate group called Vantage Meridian Partners, which had been in a protracted dispute with Bennett Development Group over a contested land acquisition in the city's eastern corridor. The 3rd man, the one who'd run, was recovered from a motel outside the city limits 48 hours later. The figure on the mezzanine turned out to be a lookout who'd been detained by Carver's officer on the stairs and had, in the specific way of people who are lowest in a hierarchy and most exposed to its consequences, cooperated extensively. Sophia sat through 3 separate police interviews, 2 with her attorney present and 1 that was more informal, and answered everything accurately and completely. She was good in those rooms, precise, useful. She gave them the timeline of the evening from her perspective, which was the perspective of someone who had been aware that something was wrong only after Daniel was already moving. She didn't minimize his role. When the detective asked her to describe what she'd witnessed, she described it without softening the operational specificity of it. because the truth was that what she'd witnessed had been swift and controlled and completely unlike anything she'd seen any civilian do, and the detective should have that information accurately. The detective, whose name was Reyes, had looked at her across the table and said, "Ms. Bennett, you're the man with you. How did he know to watch for this kind of formation before anything happened?" She had thought about Daniel in the parking structure, in the concrete light, saying I was a Navy SEAL. Training, she'd said. Old training. Reyes had written something down and moved on. The media coverage was managed. Her communications director handled it, releasing a controlled statement that confirmed the incident, confirmed the arrest of 2 individuals, and attributed the prevention of harm to quick response by private security personnel on site, which was technically arguable and practically necessary. Sophia reviewed the statement and approved it. Daniel's name did not appear. She called him the morning the statement went out. "Communications released something," she said. "You're not named. They referenced security personnel. I wanted you to know before you heard it elsewhere." A pause. "That's fine." "Is it?" "Yes. It's exactly what I'd have asked for." A beat. "How are you doing?" She'd been asked this question 6 times in the preceding 48 hours, by her attorney, by Carver, by Marcus, by her mother in a phone call that lasted 22 minutes and covered the incident in the first 4 of them, and her general life choices in the remaining 18. She'd said "I'm fine" each time because it was mostly true and because the alternative was a longer conversation than she had capacity for. With Daniel, she said, "I'm still processing." "Yeah," he said, "that's normal." "It doesn't feel normal." "Normal isn't the right word. It's appropriate. There's a difference." She thought about that. When did it stop feeling? How long does it take before you can think about something like that without your hands doing what mine are currently doing? What are your hands doing? "They're fine when I'm working. When I stop working, they shake a little." That's adrenaline metabolism. It can take a week to fully clear. It'll get shorter each day. A pause. "Keep your hands busy, not with a screen, with something physical, cooking, building something, whatever. It helps the body finish processing what it started." She looked at her hands. "You've told people this before." "A few times." "Teammates." "Yeah." The word sat between them for a moment. Not uncomfortably. It was just a word, a factual word about a factual part of his life that was now part of this conversation, whether or not either of them had planned it. "Daniel," she said. "The people who organized what happened at the gala, Vantage Meridian, it came from the land dispute, the one in the Eastern Corridor." "I know," Carver briefed me. "That's my business that put you in that room. My conflict, my acquisition, my—" "Stop." She stopped. "You didn't arrange an attack on yourself," he said, "and I was there because I wanted to be there. Those are the only facts that matter." He said it the way he said most things, not to end a conversation, but to accurately locate the truth of it. "Don't take that on." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how you do that," she said. "Do what?" "Hold things the right size, not bigger than they are, not smaller." He was quiet on his end. She heard something in the background. A cabinet closing, water running briefly. The ordinary morning sounds of his kitchen. "I had a lot of practice making things bigger than they were," he said finally. "And then I had Grace, and she was 6 pounds and 4 ounces, and she was exactly the size she was, and there wasn't room for making things bigger than they were anymore." A pause. "It's not a skill exactly. It's more like something you get forced into." She sat with that. "How is she?" Sophia asked. "Grace." "She knows something happened. She's perceptive like that." He said it with the particular tone of a parent who is proud of a quality and simultaneously exhausted by it. "I told her there was an incident at a party, that everyone was okay, that some people got arrested. She asked 3 follow-up questions, determined I was telling the truth, and not the edited version, and then asked whether she could get a hamster." Sophia laughed. It came out of her before she could route it through anything, and it felt good, the physical release of it, the way it cleared something out. "What did you tell her?" "I told her we'd discuss the hamster." "That's a yes." "It's a not no. There's a difference." She was still smiling when they ended the call. She sat at her desk for a moment afterward without opening anything, not her email, not the briefing document Marcus had left on her chair, just sitting, with her hands in her lap, not shaking. She picked up a pen and turned it over twice and set it down. Then she opened her calendar and looked at the next 6 months. What she saw was what she always saw: a complete population of meetings, calls, site visits, board sessions, industry events, quarterly reviews. Her life organized into 90-minute increments, color-coded by category. It was efficient. It was comprehensive. It was, she realized, with the kind of clarity that tends to arrive after adrenaline has finished clearing your system, almost entirely professional, with a thin band of personal obligation, a dinner with her mother, a friend's birthday, threaded through it like an afterthought. She looked at it for a long time. Then she called Marcus in. He stood in her doorway with his notepad, ready for instructions. "I want to restructure my schedule," she said. "I want everything that can be delegated, delegated. I want Hendricks running the Meridian site visits on alternating weeks. I want the quarterly reviews handled at the division head level, unless there's something that genuinely requires me." She paused. "And I want Fridays after 3 blocked, non-negotiable, not for anything." Marcus wrote things down without expression, which was one of his better qualities. "The Henderson board call is Friday the 14th at 4, he said. "Move it to Thursday. And the architect review on the 21st, Hendricks can cover it. She's been ready for more responsibility for 8 months, and I've been too busy to give it to her." She paused. "And that's on me, not on her. Fix it." Marcus finished writing. He looked at his notepad and then at her with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. "Is everything all right?" he said. "Yes." She thought about it. "I'm making some adjustments." He nodded and left. She spent the next 3 weeks doing something she was not naturally good at, which was letting things happen without her. Delegating, in the real sense. Not handing something off while mentally monitoring every step of it, but actually releasing it and trusting the people she'd hired to handle it. It was uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who has built a professional identity around being the person who knows everything and controls the quality of it. And she was honest with herself about the discomfort, rather than performing a grace she didn't feel. Hendricks called her twice in the first week with questions she could have answered herself, and Sophia answered them briefly and then said, "What do you think the right call is?" And both times Hendricks had an answer that was correct, and Sophia had said so and ended the call. The second week, Hendricks didn't call at all. The third week, the Meridian site came in 3 days ahead of schedule on the interior rough-in phase, which had never happened on a project Sophia hadn't personally overseen, and she sat with that information for a while before deciding that it probably said something worth hearing. She started using Friday afternoons. She walked. She cooked things she hadn't made in years. Her mother's chicken recipe, a pasta she used to make in her apartment in the early days of the company when the budget for takeout was thin. She bought plants for the apartment, which she'd avoided for years on the logic that she was never home long enough to water them, and watered them on Fridays. She called her friend Diane, who she'd been meaning to call for 3 months and keeping not calling, and they had a real conversation for 45 minutes that had nothing to do with business. It didn't fix everything. She was still who she was, still organized, still driven, still genuinely more comfortable solving problems than sitting with them. But she started to be able to tell the difference between problems that needed solving urgently and problems that needed sitting with first, which was a distinction she'd been flattening for years. On a Saturday in late June, she brought lunch to the park instead of going for ice cream after. She'd made sandwiches that morning, actual sandwiches, not catered, not ordered. She'd gone to the grocery store on Friday and bought the things and made them that morning, which felt significant and also slightly absurd that it felt significant. Grace inspected her sandwich with professional skepticism. "What's in it?" "Turkey, provolone, mustard on one half, mayo on the other, because I didn't know which you preferred." Grace nodded slowly. "I like the mustard side." "Good. I like the mayo side." "We're compatible," Grace said, with the satisfaction of someone whose compatibility theory has just been validated. Daniel watched this exchange with an expression that Sophia was beginning to be able to read. A quiet amusement that he kept below the surface because he was a person who'd spent a long time keeping things below the surface. And it was a hard habit to reverse, but the amusement was there if you knew where to look. "You made these," he said, not a question. "This morning." He looked at the sandwich. "How's the cooking going?" "I burned the chicken on Tuesday. The pasta on Thursday was actually good." She paused. "Don't look so surprised." "I'm not surprised. You have a face right now." "This is just my face." Grace found this deeply funny. They ate at the park bench near the pond. Grace positioned between them with her mustard half and her strong opinions about which ducks were behaving correctly today, and afterward Grace ran to the far end of the park, where the playground equipment was, and Sophia and Daniel sat on the bench in the late June warmth and watched her. Carver's security review came back, Sophia said, on the Eastern Corridor situation. Vantage Meridian's case is collapsing. The principals are cooperating with prosecutors to reduce exposure. It's not going to be a continued threat. That's good. Carver agrees. He's upgrading some of the building-level protocols anyway. He said, she paused. He said whoever assessed the situation at the gala had better threat recognition than anyone he'd worked with in 19 years of law enforcement. He wanted to know who it was. Daniel said nothing. I told him it was a friend with good instincts, she said. That works? She watched Grace conquer the climbing structure with the determined energy of someone who has decided that summit is the only acceptable outcome. I've been thinking, Sophia said, about the neighborhood project, the Callaway Street renovation, and the 3 adjacent blocks we assessed last year. She said it carefully, aware of the ground she was on. I pulled the feasibility report from last spring. There's a case for a larger community development push. Affordable housing, mixed income, proper investment rather than patchwork maintenance. But I want to... She stopped, restarted. I want to ask you something, not tell you something. He turned slightly toward her. What do you think the neighborhood actually needs, she said. Not what looks good in a presentation, not what the feasibility metrics favor. What do the people in that building, on that block, actually need? He was quiet for a moment. She waited. The heating, he said. Not renovated heating. Consistent heating. There's a difference. You can put in a new boiler, and if the building management doesn't maintain it properly in 2 years, you're back where you started. He looked at the pond. The elementary school on Ferris Street has a leaking roof that's been on the maintenance list for 3 years. 3 years. Kids sitting in classrooms with buckets. He paused. The corner store on Callaway and 9th is the closest grocery to 6 blocks of residential. It's been there 30 years. It barely has room for produce, and produce is what it sells least of because produce requires margin and margin requires volume. He was quiet for a moment. It's not that people need charity. They need the infrastructure to work. When it doesn't work, everything costs more. Time, money, health. You spend 2 hours on public transit for a job that's 20 minutes away in a car. You pay more for food because the good grocery is 3 miles away, and you don't have a car. You're always catching up to a gap that gets a little wider every year. Sophia was listening in the way she'd learned to listen to him, completely, without preparing a response. What would you change first? She said. The school roof, he said, immediately, without hesitation. Everything else is for adults. The roof is for kids. Kids can't advocate for themselves or vote or show up to a city council meeting. The roof should have been fixed 3 years ago. She pulled out her phone and opened a note. I'm not arranging anything, she said. I'm writing it down so I have it. He watched her type. School roof, he said. Ferris Street Elementary. There's also a section of the gymnasium floor that's warped bad enough that the PE teacher has had the kids doing exercises on the stage for 2 semesters. She typed. Callaway 9th Corner Store. The owner's name is Paul Eckert. He's been there 30 years, and he'd expand the produce section tomorrow if he had refrigeration capacity. He doesn't because commercial refrigeration for a small operator is a capital expense he can't absorb. She typed. They sat on the bench for another 20 minutes, and he talked about the neighborhood with the specific knowledge of someone who'd lived in it for 5 years and paid attention. And she listened and typed and asked questions that were genuine questions, not proposals dressed as questions. It was the most useful conversation she'd had about community development in 3 years, and none of it would appear in a feasibility report, because none of it was quantifiable in the way that feasibility reports required. At some point, Grace materialized between them, slightly out of breath from the climbing structure, and wedged herself onto the bench in the space that wasn't quite large enough for her. What are you talking about? She asked. The neighborhood, Sophia said. Grace considered this. Our neighborhood needs a bigger park, she said. This one is good, but it only has 1 climbing structure. Priya's neighborhood has 2. Noted, Sophia said. Daniel looked at her over Grace's head with an expression that was finally a full smile. Not the infrastructure of one. The actual thing. It changed his face completely.
loosened something that was usually held carefully in place, made him look for a moment like someone who had not spent years practicing the containment of himself. She looked at it for a second longer than she should have. Then she looked back at Grace. "Tell me more about the second climbing structure," she said. "What does Priya's neighborhood have that we're missing?" Grace had extensive opinions on this subject. The school roof was the first thing Sophia moved on, and she moved on it quietly, not through Bennett Development Group's main operations, but through a direct call to the district facilities office that she'd had Marcus find the right contact for, and a conversation with the district's capital projects coordinator about expedited timeline on a repair that had been in the queue for too long. She didn't offer funding. She offered to connect the district with a contractor from her network who would do the work at correct cost without the usual markup that city contracts attracted. The coordinator, whose name was Fenwick, and who had spent 11 years watching maintenance queues stretch and snap, said yes within 48 hours. The roof work started in mid-July during the summer break and was finished before September. She didn't tell Daniel she'd done it. She told herself this was because it was genuinely not her story to tell. It was Ferris Street Elementary's story, and the kids, and Fenwick's, and she believed this. She also knew it was because she wanted to have done something clean, for the right reason, without it being seen. Daniel found out through Mrs. Okafor, who found out through a woman at her book club whose granddaughter attended the school. He knocked on Sophia's door on a Tuesday evening in August, unannounced, which he'd never done before. She opened the door in the clothes she'd been wearing to work, minus the jacket, which she'd dropped over the kitchen chair. Her apartment was more lived in than it used to be. The plants on the windowsill, a cookbook on the counter open to a page she'd been reading, a jacket over the chair that she hadn't immediately hung up. He stood in the hallway and looked at her. "The school roof," he said. "Yes." "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to say anything about." He studied her for a moment. "You're not going to tell me about the corner store refrigeration unit either, are you?" he said. She had, 2 weeks prior, connected Paul Eckert with a commercial equipment leasing contact and spent 40 minutes on a conference call between the three parties that had resulted in a favorable leasing arrangement that Paul had said was the best business news he'd had in 5 years. She had not mentioned this to Daniel. "That was Paul's conversation," she said, "not mine." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He had the look of someone reassessing something important, recalculating against new information. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back from the door. He came into the apartment and stood in the kitchen entry and looked around in the specific way he looked at spaces, thoroughly, without appearing to. She watched him take in the plants and the cookbook and the jacket over the chair and the 2 glasses in the drying rack that indicated she'd had someone over for dinner recently, which was her friend Diane, which she did not explain because it was not relevant. "You've changed some things," he said. "I'm working on it. The schedule." "Marcus told you?" "Marcus didn't tell me anything. Grace told me you come to the park on Friday afternoon sometimes, alone, with a book." She hadn't known Grace had noticed that. "I needed somewhere to be that wasn't work," she said. "The park seemed like it fit." He nodded slowly. She put on coffee because it was something to do with her hands, and because it was 8 in the evening and caffeine would keep her up and she was doing it anyway. "I owe you an apology," he said, while she was filling the carafe. She turned around. "The building," he said. "The night I called you. The things I said about how you were handling it. You were right." "I was right about the specific thing," he said. "I was harder about it than I needed to be." He looked at the counter. I'm not good at letting people in without making them feel like they're being tested. I don't always know I'm doing it until after." She looked at him steadily. "You were testing me," she said. "Yeah. And the park. The Saturdays." "I wasn't being calculating about it," he said. "It wasn't deliberate. But yeah, I was watching how you were. With Grace, with the neighborhood, with all of it. What you did when things didn't go how you expected." He paused. "It's a thing I do. It's not always fair." She poured water into the machine and pressed the button and turned around to lean against the counter. "Did I pass?" she said. He looked at her. Something in his face had shifted. Not the smile, not the warmth she'd seen at the park, but something more serious than that. The kind of look that belongs to someone who has been honest with themselves about what they want and has arrived, carefully, at the decision to say it. "Yeah," he said. "You passed."
The coffee maker made its preliminary sounds. She stayed where she was against the counter, and he stayed where he was near the kitchen entry, and neither of them moved immediately, which was its own kind of conversation. "Daniel," she said. "I know," he said, and then quieter. "I know." He crossed the kitchen in the unhurried way of someone who has thought this through, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the old scar along his jaw that she'd noticed early and never mentioned. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, completely, without pretense. "I haven't done this in a long time," he said. "Not apologetic, just true." "Neither have I," she said. "Not this kind." He raised one hand and pushed a strand of hair back from her face with a kind of gentleness that seemed at odds with and completely consistent with everything else she knew about him, and she understood in that moment that both of those things being true simultaneously was just what he was, and that she'd been understanding it in pieces for months. She kissed him first. He seemed to have been expecting her to. Outside the kitchen window, the city did what cities do in August evenings. It hummed and moved and went about its ordinary business, indifferent to the specific gravity of small moments. A bus went past 2 streets over. Somewhere a dog barked 3 times and stopped. Inside the kitchen, 2 people who had both been careful for a very long time were, for a moment, not careful. Later, they sat at the kitchen table with the coffee she'd made, and Grace was mentioned, and logistics, and the way things would need to be handled with care, because Grace was 7 in September, and perceptive beyond her years, and would notice everything and had opinions about everything she noticed. "She's going to say she knew first," Sophia said. "She will," he said, "and she'll be right." Sophia thought about Grace on the park bench, wedged into the space that wasn't quite large enough for her, delivering her verdict on the neighborhood's climbing structure deficit. "That's fair," she said. He drank his coffee and looked at the plants on the windowsill. "The one on the left is getting too much direct sun," he said. She looked. "I thought they needed sun." "They do. Not noon sun through south-facing glass." He stood and moved it 2 feet to the right on the sill, out of the direct rectangle of light. Better. She watched him do this with a feeling she didn't have a clean name for, something between amusement and the kind of gratitude that isn't about a specific act, but about the accumulation of small ones. "Anything else wrong with my apartment?" she said. He looked around seriously. "The jacket over the chair," he said. "I'm getting to it." "You've been getting to it since I came in." "That's true." She didn't get up. He left at 10:30 because Grace would be up at 6 regardless of what day it was or what had happened the night before, which was a fixed and immovable fact of his life, and she didn't try to make him stay. At the door he turned back once. "Ferris Street Elementary," he said. "The gymnasium floor." She looked at him. "The PE teacher's name is Kowalski," he said. "She's been asking the district for 2 years. She's a good teacher. The kids like her. The floor is warped enough that someone's going to turn an ankle before long." Sophia held the doorframe. "I'll find Fenwick's number," she said. He nodded once and left. She closed the door and stood in her apartment in the particular quiet of a space that has recently held more people than it usually does and is adjusting back to its normal size. She went to the window and moved the second plant 2 inches left, testing whether that made it better, and decided it did. September arrived the way it always did in the city, with the particular quality of light that came when the summer heat finally broke. A sharpness to the morning air that made everything feel slightly more awake than it had been for months. The trees along Callaway Street were just starting to turn at the edges, that first hesitant blush of yellow that preceded the full change by 2 weeks. Grace Carter turned 7 on the 14th of September. She had decided, with the comprehensive certainty she brought to all major decisions, that the birthday required a party at the park, a cake with a duck on it because of the ducks, and the presence of Sophia, who by September had stopped being a visitor to the Carter apartment and had become, in Grace's personal taxonomy, simply a fixture, as natural and expected as the chipped mug and the drawing on the fridge and the cat from downstairs who came and went according to its own logic. Daniel made the cake himself. This was not a decision he'd made lightly. He was competent in the kitchen, not creative in it, and a duck cake required a level of decorative ambition that sat outside his usual range. He attempted it on a Friday evening while Grace was at Jess's apartment 2 floors up, and the result was technically a duck, in the way that certain abstract paintings were technically landscapes. The body was convincing, the bill was disproportionate, one eye was slightly higher than the other, giving the duck an expression of vague existential concern. He photographed it and sent it to Sophia with no caption. She responded 40 seconds later. That duck has seen things. He sent back, "Don't start." She sent, "I'm framing this." He put the phone face down on the counter and felt the particular warmth of being known well enough to be made fun of correctly. The party was 9 children, 4 parents, 1 grandmother, and Sophia, who arrived with a bag of extra bread for the ducks, and a wrapped gift that Grace intercepted before anyone else could comment on it. The gift was a set of field guides, birds, insects, plants, the proper naturalist kind with detailed illustrations, not the simplified children's version, because Sophia had spent enough Saturdays with Grace to know that the simplified version would have been an insult. Grace opened them with the focused reverence she reserved for things that mattered. "These are real ones," she said. "They're the ones actual naturalists use," Sophia said. Grace looked at her with an expression that communicated both gratitude and the recognition that Sophia had paid attention. "Thank you," she said. And then, with the directness that had characterized her from the beginning, "You're good at gifts." "I had good information," Sophia said. Daniel watched this from 3 feet away and said nothing. The party was not smooth or beautiful in the way that events are when someone professional has arranged them. 2 of Grace's classmates argued about whose turn it was on the climbing structure and required adult mediation. The duck cake, presented after the sandwiches, was received by the children with an enthusiasm that was entirely sincere, the existentially concerned duck apparently being funnier and more beloved than a technically correct one would have been. One of the parent chaperones, a man named Greg, who had a lot of opinions about youth soccer leagues, managed to corner Daniel for 11 minutes about recreational league registration before Sophia materialized at Daniel's elbow and redirected the conversation with a professional smoothness that Greg didn't notice and Daniel noticed completely. Walking back from the park in the late afternoon, Grace between them holding both field guides and the last third of a juice box, Daniel said quietly, "Greg, I saw," she said. "You extracted me. I'm good at exits." She said it without drama. "That's actually a transferable skill from corporate events." He looked at her sideways. "Thank you. Anytime." Grace looked up at both of them with the particular expression of a 7-year-old who is absorbing information about adult social dynamics and filing it carefully. "Greg talks too much," Grace said. "Grace," Daniel said, "it's true. He talked for the whole time we were eating and nobody asked him anything." "That's true," Sophia said, "but we don't say it out loud." "Why not?" "Because sometimes people don't know they're doing it, and saying it doesn't help them. It just makes them feel bad." Grace considered this with the seriousness she brought to ethical questions. "But if nobody tells him, he'll keep doing it." "That's the paradox," Sophia said. "Yes." Grace thought about this for half a block. "I think someone should tell him," she said finally. "Nicely. But someone should." Daniel said nothing. He was looking straight ahead with the expression of a man who is holding something carefully in his face. Sophia glanced at him. "She's right," he said, quietly. "I know she is," Sophia said. October brought rain and the completion of the Callaway Street renovation, which finished on a Thursday afternoon with the kind of undramatic finality that big projects often had. A crew loading equipment, a final sign-off, Mrs. Okafor inspecting the newly refinished lobby floor with the critical attention of someone who had been waiting 2 years for this and was not going to be easily satisfied. She was ultimately satisfied. She told the foreman he'd done good work, which from Mrs. Okafor was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The building felt different, not transformed. It was still old, still a building that had accrued decades of wear that no renovation fully erased. But the heating worked reliably. The elevator ran without its intermittent hesitation. The hallways were brighter. The entrance had been repointed and re-weather stripped, which meant the cold no longer came in at the bottom of the door, the way it had for years. This draft that every resident had simply incorporated into their understanding of winter without naming it as a problem because it had always been there. It was the kind of improvement that didn't photograph well, but that you felt every day. Daniel walked through the building the evening after the crew left. Not inspecting it in any official capacity, He wasn't affiliated with the project and hadn't been, deliberately. He just walked through it the way he walked through any space he cared about, looking at the work. It was good work. He stood in the lobby for a moment, looking at the refinished floor, the new light fixtures, the repaired entry. He thought about what Sophia had said months ago in the conference room with the closed folder, that she wanted him in an operations leadership role. He'd said no for the right reasons. He still believed those reasons, but he was aware, standing in his own building's lobby, that he was also aware of a different question now. Not whether to take what she offered, but what he actually wanted to build with the things he already had. He had construction experience. He had, buried under 5 years of silence, a half-finished architectural degree from before the Navy, abandoned in the second year when the recruiter came to campus, and something in him that was 20 years old and looking for a mission had said yes before he'd finished thinking. He'd taken 3 night courses since moving to the Denton district, quietly, at the community college, with the particular self-consciousness of a 37-year-old in a classroom full of 22-year-olds, and the work had come back to him faster than he'd expected. The principles were still there, the eye for space and structure, the intuition for how things needed to connect. He hadn't told Sophia about the courses. He hadn't told anyone. He told her in November, on a Friday evening in her kitchen. Her kitchen now genuinely used, the cookbook spine creased from regular opening, a second mug that was specifically his, when she asked how his week had been, and he said, for the first time, I turned in a project for my structures course. She looked up from what she was doing. He told her about the courses, the 3 he'd taken, the 4th he was registered for, the provisional conversation he'd had with the program coordinator about whether his existing construction experience could count towards certain practical requirements. He told it factually, without drama, the way he told most things. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she put down what she was holding. How long have you been doing this? She said. 2 years. 2 years. I wasn't ready to talk about it. A pause. It felt like something I should know whether I wanted before I made it into a conversation. She looked at him steadily. And now? I want it, he said, simply. I want to do the kind of work that's in that building downstairs, the kind that actually matters to the people living in it, not the kind that looks good in a portfolio. He paused. I know that's not fast. I know finishing the degree takes time, and then there's licensing, and I'll probably be 40 before I'm doing it at the level where it counts. Daniel, she said. He stopped. You pulled me out of a crushed car, she said, with your bare hands, in under 90 seconds. And you did it because someone needed help, and you didn't want anything for it, and then you walked away. She looked at him. You can finish an architectural degree. That's not the hard part of who you are. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I just needed to say it out loud to someone. She nodded once. Good, she said. And then, can I see the project? He pulled out his phone and showed her. It was a community center concept, modest in scale, designed for a neighborhood lot type he'd been studying, with an emphasis on flexible interior space that could serve multiple functions without requiring expensive reconfiguration. She looked at it for a long time, zooming in on sections, asking specific questions about the structural decisions, the material choices, the circulation logic. She asked good questions. That was one of the things he'd learned about her. Underneath the boardroom competence, she actually understood how things were built, both because she'd been in construction development for 6 years and because she was genuinely curious in the way that made information stick rather than slide off. The entrance sequence, she said. This works better than most community center proposals I've seen from actual firms. It's a first draft. I know. I'm not making a procurement decision. I'm telling you it's good. He looked at his own drawing on the screen for a moment through her eyes. Yeah, he said. I think it might be. The winter passed in increments. The gymnasium floor at Ferris Street Elementary was repaired in December, during the break, by a contractor Sophia had connected to Fenwick, and Ms. Kowalski sent an email to the facilities coordinator that Fenwick forwarded to Sophia that said simply, the kids came back in January and just stopped in the doorway and looked at it. 6 seconds of silence. Then somebody yelled, and they all ran in. Sophia read this at her desk and sat with it for a moment before forwarding it to Daniel with no comment. He responded 3 hours later. That's the one. She understood what he meant. That was the kind of impact that didn't appear in any report. the 6 seconds of silence before the yell. The moment where something broken was repaired and the people who'd lived with the broken version simply absorbed the improvement without having to explain what it cost them that it had been broken. That was the kind of thing worth building toward. Marcus noticed the change in her which she expected, because Marcus noticed everything and had the professional discretion to say nothing until it was relevant. He mentioned it once, in January, in the particular oblique way he had of addressing things that he considered both important and delicate. "The Hendricks delegation is working well," he said, setting a report on her desk. "I know." She asked to take the lead on the Eastern Corridor project, the revised one. "I know." I told her yes. He stood there for a moment longer than the information required. "You seem," he started. "Marcus." "Better," he finished, "if that's an acceptable observation." She looked at him. "It's acceptable." He nodded and left. She thought about the word. Better. It was imprecise in the way that the most accurate descriptions often were. She wasn't better at her job. She was differently good at it, which wasn't the same. She was faster at the things that required her specifically and less attached to the things that didn't, which freed up something she hadn't known was being consumed. She still worked hard. She still cared about the outcomes. She still sat at her desk at 9:15 on Thursday evenings, going through numbers that she probably didn't need to review personally, because some habits were built deep enough that untangling them was a long project. But she left on Fridays at 3. She cooked on weekends. She called Diane back within a week instead of within a month. She had plants that were alive and correctly lit. She was learning, slowly and imperfectly, the difference between building something and controlling it, and that the difference mattered in every dimension of a life, not just in business. In March, 1 year, almost exactly, from the morning the scaffold came down on a black Mercedes on Meridian Avenue, Sophia found herself sitting on the floor of Daniel's apartment helping Grace with a school project about ecosystems, which required the construction of a diorama representing a freshwater pond habitat, which required more creative problem-solving than Sophia's entire week had otherwise demanded. Grace had strong opinions about the placement of the model cattails. "They go on the edge," Grace said, "not in the middle. Cattails are edge plants." "How do you know that?" Sophia asked. Grace held up the bird and plant field guide, open to the wetland section. "It says right here, edge plants. They need shallow water." Sophia looked at the guide, which was well used now. The spine cracked, several pages with small pencil marks where Grace had noted her own sightings in the park. A 7-year-old's field notes. She looked at it and felt something she recognized, from enough proximity to it now to name it correctly: pride. Not hers to own exactly, but the kind that came from watching someone become more fully themselves. Daniel was at the table behind them doing structural calculations for his course, occasionally being consulted on the diorama when Grace's questions exceeded Sophia's expertise, which was more often than Sophia would have preferred. At some point, the cattails were resolved, and Grace moved on to the placement of model ducks, which she had made from clay that afternoon with varying success. Some were more duck-shaped than others, and the less successful ones she designated as unusual species, a solution Sophia found both pragmatic and philosophically sound. "Dad," Grace said, holding up 2 clay lumps, "which one is better?" Daniel looked up from his calculations. He studied both the ducks with the seriousness the question merited. "The one on the left," he said. "The other one looks like it had a hard winter." "That's what I thought," Grace said, and placed the left duck in the pond. Sophia caught Daniel's eye over Grace's head. He had the expression she'd come to know best, the quiet warmth that lived just below the surface of the more careful version of him, the version that was present when Grace was there and something was simply good, unremarkably good, in the particular way of Tuesday evenings and solved problems and clay ducks. She thought about the morning she'd stood in her own lobby after he'd left her apartment for the first time, moving a plant 2 inches and deciding it was better. She thought about what it cost to finally let something grow without engineering it. Later, after the diorama was finished and photographed, and Grace had gone to bed, after 2 stories and a digression about whether the unusual species duck might recover by spring, and Daniel's verdict that it probably would with rest and consistent feeding, Sophia and Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the particular quiet of a space that had held a lot of people and a lot of noise and had settled back into itself. The coffee was decaf because it was 10 at night and neither of them was 25 anymore. a fact Grace had helpfully noted recently when she'd found the decaf box in the cabinet and asked why they were buying the weak kind. She's going to be something, Sophia said. She already is something, Daniel said. I know, She stopped. I mean the world is going to be better for having her in it. He looked at her. Something in his face went still in the particular way it did when she said something that reached somewhere real. Yeah, he said. I think so too. She turned the mug in her hands, the chipped one, which she used now without thinking about the chip. I've been thinking about the community development framework, the Callaway model. Hendricks wants to replicate it in 2 other districts. Proper community consultation first, infrastructure-led. Start with what's actually broken rather than what's most visible. She paused. I want to build a proper program around it, not a PR initiative, an actual operational model with a long timeline and real accountability. Good, he said. I want someone who can do the on-the-ground assessment, not a consultant, someone who actually lives in these neighborhoods and understands what's invisible in a feasibility report. She looked at him. I know you're not done with your degree. I know that's 2 years, maybe more. I'm not asking you to take a position. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to consult. Informally, on your terms. He was quiet for a moment. What does informal mean? He said. It means you tell me when something's wrong and I listen. It means your name isn't on anything unless you want it to be. It means you can say no to any specific thing for any reason, and that's not a problem. She paused. It means I'm asking, not arranging. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said, I can do that. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm going to tell you when you're wrong. I know, she said. That's part of why I'm asking. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the city moved through its late-night register, quieter than daytime, not silent, the particular breathing of a place that never fully stops. The plant on the windowsill, the one he'd moved on the first night at her apartment, had grown since then. A new stem, 2 new leaves. It wasn't dramatic growth. It was the kind that happened incrementally, day by day, when conditions were right and something was given what it actually needed. There was something Sophia had been thinking about for weeks and hadn't said. She'd been sitting with it in the way he'd taught her, without forcing a resolution before it was ready. She said it now. I know you get calls, she said, from that world. The Tanner calls. Or calls like them. He didn't deny it. He'd told her about Tanner months ago, one evening when it had come up naturally, and she'd listened without reacting in the way she was proud of. They've slowed down, he said. They slow down when people accept that the answer isn't changing. But they come. Yeah. And you always say no. Yes. She held her mug. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking because I actually want to understand, not because I'm worried about the answer. He waited. Do you miss it? She said. Not in the way you told Tanner, actually. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she knew he was answering honestly rather than quickly. I miss the clarity, he said finally. In that world, the mission is the mission. You know what you're doing and you know why, and everyone around you knows the same thing and would do anything for you and you for them. He paused. Civilian life doesn't have that. Everything's complicated and layered and partial, and nobody's operating with the same information, and most people are trying to do right by themselves in ways that are sometimes good and sometimes not. He looked at the table. I spent a long time thinking the clarity was the thing I'd lost and couldn't get back. Like the world out here was defective because it wasn't that. And now, she said, now I think the clarity was real, but it was also limited. The mission was always defined before I arrived. Someone else decided what mattered, and I executed it with everything I had. He looked up at her. Out here, nobody tells you what the mission is. You have to decide, and that's harder, and it's messier, and you get it wrong more than you'd expect. He paused. But it's yours. The things you build, Grace, this neighborhood, whatever this is, he gestured, a gesture that included the kitchen and the plant, and her, nobody handed you those. You chose them. Sophia looked at him. That's worth more than clarity, she said. Yeah, he said. It took me a while. She thought about a man who had run toward a crushed car because someone needed help, who had then walked away before anyone could thank him, who had raised a daughter alone in a tired building in a neighborhood that a development company had passed on, who had taken night courses for 2 years without telling anyone because he wanted to know he meant it before it became a conversation. She thought about all the ways a person could be brave, and how few of them involved anything that would photograph well or make the news for a day and a half. She thought about what it actually meant to choose a life rather than execute one. She thought she was still learning. She thought she'd probably always be still learning, which used to feel like a failure condition and now felt more like the actual description of being alive. The community center project, she said, your course project. What about it? Have you thought about what neighborhood it would go in, if it were real? He looked at her. Denton District, he said. 3 blocks from here. There's a vacant lot on Ferris, half a block from the elementary school. City's been sitting on it for 4 years. Wrong zoning designation. It's classified light industrial, but nothing industrial has operated there since the 90s. I know that lot, she said. I looked at it 2 years ago. For development. We passed on it. Because of the zoning. Because of the zoning, she said, which can be changed. He looked at her steadily. I'm not arranging anything, she said. I'm telling you what I know about a lot. The corner of his mouth moved. I know, he said. I can tell the difference now. She could tell the difference, too, between the version of herself that would have pulled the property records and made the calls and presented him with a done deal, and the version that was sitting in his kitchen at 10:15 on a Wednesday night drinking decaf and telling him what she knew about a vacant lot and leaving the rest of the space for him to fill in. The second version was harder. It required her to sit with uncertainty, with the possibility that he'd decide differently than she'd decide, with outcomes she couldn't engineer in advance. It required trusting that what they were building together was more durable than anything she could have built alone. She was getting better at it, imperfectly, day by day. Sometime later, not that night, but in the way that things move forward when the conditions are right, Daniel Carter would submit a rezoning inquiry to the city planning office regarding the vacant lot on Ferris Street, 3 blocks from Callaway and half a block from the elementary school, where the roof no longer leaked and the gymnasium floor was no longer warped. He would submit it under his own name, with a project concept attached, which was still a draft, and which he knew was still a draft, and which he submitted anyway, because at some point the waiting for perfect readiness becomes indistinguishable from fear. The inquiry would begin a process that was slow and bureaucratic, and required 3 separate meetings with a city planner named Dubois, who had a lot of questions, all of which Daniel answered with the patience of someone who'd learned that the things worth building took the time they took. Sophia would not appear in that process in any official capacity. She would give him Fenwick's number, as she'd given it before, and leave it at that. But on the evening he told her the rezoning had been approved. He told her in the kitchen, the same kitchen, Grace asleep in the next room, the plant on the windowsill now requiring occasional pruning because it had gotten too large for its original pot. Sophia put down what she was holding and looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, in the park in late June, when something that had been held carefully was, for a moment, not held carefully at all. Congratulations, she said. It's just the rezoning, he said. There's a long way between that and anything real. I know, she said. Congratulations anyway. He sat across from her at the table, and between them were the ordinary things of an ordinary evening. 2 mugs, a course textbook with a page marked, a drawing Grace had left on the table of what appeared to be the duck pond populated by both anatomically correct ducks and the unusual species, who seemed to have recovered from their hard winter. He looked at all of it. He thought about what a mission was, not the version he'd been trained to execute, clear, defined, given to him by someone else with better intelligence and a wider view. The other version, the one nobody assigned and nobody measured and nobody gave you a debrief on when it was over, because it was never fully over, because the things worth doing didn't end the way operations ended. They just kept requiring you every day to show up and mean it. He'd spent 6 years believing the quiet life was what he owed Grace, that it was the sacrifice he'd made, the trade, battlefield for breakfast table, clarity for complication. He understood now that it wasn't a trade, it was just a life. His life. The one he'd chosen and kept choosing, in a small kitchen in a neighborhood that was slowly, imperfectly getting better, with a 7-year-old who took field notes in the margins of her naturalist guides, and a woman who had learned to ask before arranging, and who moved plants 2 inches to the left when she thought no one was watching. Grace's drawing of the duck pond sat between the coffee mugs in the warm light of the kitchen. The unusual species duck, improbably, was centered in the image, the lopsided one, the one that had looked like it had a hard winter. And around it the water was depicted in Grace's particular style, which involved a lot of blue crayon applied with enthusiasm over a rough outline of the world as she understood it. It wasn't accurate. It was better than accurate. Daniel looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Sophia, who was looking at the drawing too. "She put the unusual duck in the middle," Sophia said. "She always does," he said. Outside, the city went about its life. The bus on the street 2 blocks over. The dog somewhere. The ordinary percussion of a place that held, in its crowded and imperfect way, several 100,000 people all navigating the same fundamental problem: how to be in the world without losing what mattered in the process. It was not a problem with a clean solution. Daniel had stopped looking for one. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and the evening continued, and that was enough.